Hello and welcome. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. Our relentless coverage on the COVID-19 pandemic continues. And as all of you know by now, it is a catastrophe. An unprecedented humanitarian crisis is unfolding here in India, where perhaps not one home, not one family, not one person we know has not been hit by the pandemic in some way or the other. For some of us, our bereavements have been deeply personal. My own father, as some of you know, was lost to COVID this past week. But before I introduce one of the world's foremost experts on this live broadcast today from New York, award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning oncologist, immunologist, COVID frontline warrior, Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, I want to start this program with the story of another young woman who lost her father. Because what is important to understand for our audiences across the world is that in India, people are not just dying from COVID, they're dying from a lack of oxygen. We have seen calamity after calamity in hospital after hospital as medical facilities fail to get the oxygen supply that they are entitled to. This is the story of young Himanshi, who lost her father outside a premier hospital in the national capital as the oxygen ran short.
चले गए और क्यों चले गए? इनका ऑक्सीजन फ्लक्चुएशन हुआ, वो 15 लीटर पर मिनट पे थे इनके पाइप पे, जिसकी वजह से मैंने यहाँ कराया था। ऑक्सीजन फ्लक्चुएट हुआ, इनके पास ऑक्सीजन नहीं था, कार्डियक अरेस्ट हुआ, मेरे पापा मर गए।
हमने बात किया इन लोगों से, तो बोल रहे हैं हमारे पास 2 घंटे का
मर गए।
मैं ऊपर गया हूँ भैया, मैं ऊपर गया हूँ, मैंने ऊपर जाके देखा 30 चल रहा था। मेरी गाड़ी में सिलेंडर पड़े हैं, ये देखो, ये देखो, एक नहीं दो सिलेंडर पड़े हैं, ये देखो सिलेंडर देखो। मैंने सिलेंडर दिया ऊपर जाके, तब भी नहीं बचा पाए। ये बातें कर रहे हैं
बेसिक ऑक्सीजन की
कमी की वजह से।
मेरे पापा व्हाट्सएप है, उनका मैसेज आया है कि नन्नू ऑक्सीजन यहाँ खत्म हो गई है। मैंने बोला पापा फिक्र मत करो, मेरी मम्मी LNJ में, हम भागे कि ऑक्सीजन जुगाड़ करेंगे। यहाँ आके नीचे बोल रहे हैं कि ऑक्सीजन है, और ऊपर पापा
यहाँ नीचे बोला इन्होंने कि ऑक्सीजन है। मुझे लगा कुछ गलत था, मैं ऊपर भाग के गया हूँ, मैंने अपना सिलेंडर दिया, ऊपर जाके देखा तो मैनुअली पंप कर रहे थे।
भैया,
और आपके पापा का मैसेज आप दिखाएंगे मुझे व्हाट्सएप?
क्या देखोगे बताओ, क्या है, कहाँ है? पापा देखो, लास्ट है। मैंने बोला ओके पापा, दो मैं भेज रही हूँ आपको, नारियल पानी या कुछ और भेजूँ या पड़ा है? पापा ने बोला नहीं। मेरी बहन ने बोला पापा कितना पानी पिया है? फिर उनका है यहाँ ऑक्सीजन प्रॉब्लम है पूरे हॉस्पिटल में, शायद ख़त्म हो गई। मैंने बोला 3 बजे कमिंग। उसको बाद हमने पापा को मैसेज कर रहे हैं, पापा आपको मिल रही है, पापा आपको ऑक्सीजन मिलेगी, CEO से बात हुई है, उड़ू की बात हुई है, पापा कहाँ हो? पापा चले। आप बताओ मैं क्या करूँ अपने पापा के लिए?
So her daughter wants to know, what does she do? She carried oxygen herself, cylinders of oxygen to the hospital, and yet her father could not be saved. This is playing out in hospital after hospital, not just in Delhi, but across India. It is a complete and total catastrophe. And I want to bring from New York today, Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, as I said, one of the world's top experts. This city, Delhi, is a city that Siddharth grew up in. His family is from here. I know that this is personal for him in so many ways. Siddharth, thank you for making the time, and what's happening across homes, across the closed doors of emergency wards in hospitals, across crematoriums that have run out of space is absolutely heartbreaking. And I know you've been following this, but it's important to understand it isn't just COVID. It's a betrayal of the health system. It's a health system that's crumbling. It's hospitals that don't have oxygen. From where you're sitting, what is the India crisis looking like right now?
So first of all, it's heartbreaking in every way. And my condolences to you, Barkha, personally, and my condolences to everyone who's suffering. My mother is essentially in Delhi in a kind of lockdown state herself. She's elderly. My sister and her husband my niece are in Delhi. I'm communicating with them. The panic and the scare is very real. I will try to not be emotional and be very pragmatic in what is going on and how I see the field moving. But of course, please pardon me if that doesn't come through, because as you know, I'm extraordinarily concerned. I think there are three. You can think about the response to COVID in India as a triangle. And I want to talk about the three edges of the triangle. The first edge of the triangle is oxygen and steroids for patients who are getting, sort of the worst effects of COVID. The second is the infrastructural arrangements that will help prevent COVID and help potentially avoid people's hospitalizations with COVID. And the third is vaccines. So I want to talk about all three of them separately, Barkha, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So the first one, which is oxygen and steroids, I've been speaking almost on a daily basis with people who are in the field. And obviously, in parts of the country where oxygen and steroids were unavailable, steroids being dexamethasone or inhaled budesonide, were unavailable, I'm slowly being told that now that oxygen is moving. The problem is, as I'm told, the problem is I'm not an expert in the oxygen field, and there's a lot of supply chain issues in of the management of patients with COVID. I'm told that now oxygen has started moving from parts of India where it's produced to parts where it's needed. Most of it is produced in Eastern India, and most of it's required in Western and Northern India. I'm told that oxygen is now being produced. India, generally speaking, also, we've made a calculation, should have enough oxygen to supply us during this crisis. The problem is the logistics of transportation of that oxygen into medical grade cylinders where they can be produced. So I'm told that there is a task force that has been specifically assigned. I'm also told that there are many consignments of liquid oxygen that are being sent from various countries. The United States, we and others have persuaded our government, the United States government, to deploy oxygen, and so as well as steroids. I'm also told, although I don't know, as you know, I'm far away watching my mother and my family and trying to help them, and my friends, my country, I would say, trying to help them. I'm told that that the steroids, both the inhaled and the oral steroids, both of which are the centerpiece of the treatment of COVID patients, is in supply, although supply is diminishing. But I'm told by several people, including Kiran Shaw at Biocon, including lots of other people who are working in the pharmaceutical industry and supply chain, that the steroids, and so dexamethasone and budesonide, are in supply and can be obtained. So the oxygen is a major issue, and so the right place at the right time seems to be absolutely essential. And we are working at a lower level. We're working to try to see what that task force can do and cannot do. But I would urge that data to become public, and I would urge that we have full clarity from the government as to what the real oxygen supply is. because the word on the street or the testimonies on the street seem to contradict the government's claims that there's plenty of oxygen in required places. As you just saw, that's not the case. And you yourself experienced this. There are ambulances with oxygen cylinders that don't seem to work. I can come back to this issue if you want to probe this further, but the main takeaway message from this is the appointment of a task force to move oxygen and complete clarity from the government about exactly what the availability is and how quickly it can be available, and taking away from the hoarders and black marketeers who are hoarding oxygen because it is now a vital part of the COVID response. I'm told that the steroids are available. Barkha, you have a question?
Yeah, just to say, because the steroids are available in that they haven't completely vanished from the market, but they're not easy to get a hold of. It could be because people are hoarding more than they need. It could be because the dosage available, you're sometimes getting a 0.5 mg of a dexamethasone, whereas you may be prescribed a 6 mg. So there are struggles like that happening, but the main crisis continues to be oxygen, despite assurances that the oxygen is moving. Even today from Karnataka, we've had more than 20 deaths in a hospital in Mysore because the oxygen ran out. But Siddharth, your timeline on Twitter really attracted my attention because you raised, or you had some questions about anecdotal data. And it's very important that you said anecdotal data suggests that there are those in India who've got both their vaccines and are still getting the infection. Now, the vaccines were never meant to be a guarantee against infections. They were meant to be a guarantee against severe disease. And in particular, you picked up Gangaram, and we did actually go and get one of the doctors at Gangaram, all those who were tested positive, to play out a little clip for you. But I want to get your sense on what your concern is as you're looking at how two things have happened here. One is the efficacy of the vaccines against what we now possibly know about the mutant, the latest mutant strain of this virus, one. And two, of course, we're woefully short of vaccines. Our government didn't purchase enough vaccines. We gave away vaccines before we had enough for our people. We're now approving the foreign-made vaccines, but they don't exist right now. Our vaccine rates are at about 17 lakhs when they need to be at about 75 lakhs. I mean, that's the kind of gap that we're at. My first question to you, before I come to the efficacy, is, do you believe that vaccines for the moment are no longer a way out for India out of the second wave?
No, I don't believe that's the case. I think people should get vaccinated. But again, we need clarity and data. We need to be data-driven. And the data, the simplest question that we need to ask is, the two vaccines that are available in India are Covishield and Covaxin. Right? Covishield is the same as the AstraZeneca vaccine. Covaxin is the locally developed Bharat Biotech vaccine. I would urge everyone to get vaccinated at this time. There should be no vaccine hesitancy. Vaccines are, of course, the mechanism to get out of this crisis. Now, while people are being vaccinated, we also need data on what I would call the breakthrough rate post-vaccination. So in other words, we need data to find out whether, which is the B117 strain first identified in the UK, and the B1617 strain first identified in various places, including India. We need to find out if you have been completely vaccinated with, let's say, the Covishield vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, according to schedule, and you are now 4 weeks post the second dose of the vaccine, how many people are falling moderately ill, severely ill, or dying because of COVID? That would be the breakthrough rate. There's also something called the vaccine efficacy rate. It's a little more complicated. We need to find out that as well. And we need to find that out in the real world setting, not in and by real world setting, I mean as these vaccines are being administered and being given to people. This is public data. It should have been started. That project should have been started a month ago when the numbers began to rise. But those numbers are not available. There is no peer-reviewed paper that I can find yet no published paper. There's lots of claims, and I hope those claims are correct. So this is not, please do not interpret this as anything except for saying, please get vaccinated if vaccines are available. We'll talk about vaccine availability in a second. So the idea is that you absolutely have to get vaccinated, but while you are getting vaccinated, we need real world data about what the breakthrough rates are. If you have been vaccinated, what is the chance that you're getting, after full vaccination, getting severe, mild, or moderate COVID? Because that would allow us to understand the extent to which the vaccines are working or not working. And Barkha, to be totally honest, this is not an extraordinarily complex project. This is a project that can be initiated, and I'm told has been initiated. Love to see the data. I know has been working. It's hard to see things in the fog of COVID, but I think it would be important to know this data, because then we could make our policies moving forward.
So let me ask you this. I'll get to what happened at the Gangaram Hospital, which is something I know you flagged on your Twitter feed as well, and you said maybe the percentages are actually just too small, and there's something heartening about that. But what do we do right now at a time when we don't actually have vaccines? We don't have vaccines. We are at a lowest rate of vaccine rollouts. As America gets ready to get approvals for teenagers to get vaccines, we have desperate adults unable to, even elderly Indians unable to get vaccines in India. Is there something people like yourselves can do?
Yes, so we have done a lot, or we've tried to do a lot. Over last weekend, as you very well know, the national security advisors of the United States and India spoke. We have been in touch with the Biden administration, and by we, I mean really a whole community of people from India, but also not from India. This is a world problem. This is a global crisis. Have been in touch with the American administration. There was because of the Defense Act, there was a temporary halt to the export of vaccine-related raw materials from the United States to India. That I'm told now that a waiver has been obtained, and we have now been able to move the raw materials from the United States to India, so that vaccine production can be ramped up and potentially even increased dramatically. As you know, the Serum Institute of India is responsible for the majority of the vaccine production in India. And of course, Bharat Biotech is also contributing for the production of vaccines. I would imagine that as we move, we can make more vaccines. We've gotten through basically a major blockade in the production of vaccines. Now, one thing, as you very well know, is to do follow-up and to make sure that we continue to follow up. And the two pieces of follow-up that we require is still, number one, get vaccinated. Number two, ensure that the supply chain for vaccination raw materials continues from various places, including the United States. And number three, to find out what the real world effects of the vaccine are in terms of breakthrough COVID. The data seem pretty reassuring in the sense that I just posted, as you know, from Gangaram Hospital, which you will go to in a second, that the people who were vaccinated were protected from COVID. So that data seems reassuring. We just need data that has been that is not just anecdotal. There will always be people who are vaccinated who have COVID afterwards. But we need to understand what the real numbers are, not just anecdotal data, but real numbers. And I'm told that the ICMR and many hospitals are launching studies to at least give us a sense of what those real-term data are. So on all these three fronts, there have been major, I would say, breakthroughs. Vaccine raw materials are now flowing to India. We have to follow up to ensure that they're being converted into vaccines. Number two, vaccination rates will go up once there are more vaccines available. Data to figure out whether there's vaccine breakthrough and what to do about it if there is.
Yeah. So let me just play out. This remains strictly anecdotal. It's one doctor's account at Gangaram, but because you had shared it, I wanted to talk to somebody, and we spoke to, just for our audience, 37 doctors at Gangaram Hospital of 500 were fully inoculated, and 37 of them tested positive for COVID. 5 of them had to be hospitalized. This was one of the doctors' perspectives on the fact that this had happened.
We have 37 doctors out of about 500 who have tested positive. Come to think of it, in a hospital which has been at the forefront of COVID treatment, we've been treating at least 100 patients per day for the last 13 months. And oftentimes we were running at 350 patients in the hospital at any given time. So this is a group of doctors perennially exposed to COVID patients, COVID positive or negative patients who are coming to the emergency and being decided later on whether they are COVID positive or negative. We are also the doctors who are looking at 1,000 to 1,500 patients in the outpatients per day. And those patients come with relatives, and no relatives are ever tested. So there is a lot of exposure happening within the hospital to the doctors. And if 37 of them got infected over a period of maybe 3 or 4 days, detected to be infected over a course of 3 to 4 days, we have to put this in perspective of the total number of 500 patients, 500 doctors.
So you're actually saying that you don't think that it's such a big number when put into the larger context?
Absolutely. And the exposure, look at the level of exposure that the doctors are suffering in the hospital.
The most important thing to talk about is that what's got a lot of attention is that the doctors who've tested positive, and please correct us if I'm wrong, had received both doses of the vaccine. Is that correct? That both doses, or were all of you jabbed both doses, right?
Both doses and a couple of weeks thereafter. So we are expected to be at the time point in the vaccine history where we would be immune. But then don't forget that no vaccine has claimed that they will prevent infections.
Yeah.
The claims are that the vaccine will reduce the severity of the illness to less than severe. And that is a universal thing. And we also know that people who get vaccinated, they do not carry as much viral load in their mucosal surfaces, and therefore they do not cause as much dissemination of the virus as non-vaccinated people would.
It's so important what
we have 37 doctors out of about 500 who have tested.
Yeah, we already heard that. So Siddharth, I just wanted to play that little clip because the doctor's still being quite optimistic there. And he went on later to say that the 5 who had been hospitalized among those 37 had comorbidities. Does that give you hope, or is it still very much in the realm of anecdotal data?
No, it gives me a lot of hope. I mean, it is less than anecdotal data. Of course, these doctors were exposed. The data that we need is relatively simple to obtain, Barkha. And it can be obtained through a phone survey. It can be obtained through a Google survey or an internet-based survey, or any other kind of any kind of survey. And just imagine a survey which looks like this. What is your age? If you want to include comorbidities, you can. Which vaccine did you receive? What date did you receive the first shot? What date did you receive the second shot? Did you test COVID positive or have COVID symptoms? What date was that? And was the COVID confirmed by PCR or any other method, right? And then you can also ask the questions about the severity of the COVID. Were you hospitalized? how many, etc., etc. So in about 20 to 30 questions, you can get a very real understanding of what is going on in the world. So I'll give you one example. Many of the anecdotal pieces of data that are coming out are from people who were infected with COVID before they even got the vaccine. So they were infected with COVID, they got the vaccine, then they tested positive, because there is a period of time, about sometimes 3 days, 7 days, 8 days, before you exhibit the symptoms, and then you get tested. So those people are saying, oh gosh, I got the vaccine, but I tested positive. But that's, of course, only understandable. It takes you about 2 to 3 weeks. Perform such a survey. You would exclude all of these people, right? And the people you would include are people who are 2 weeks post the second dose of vaccination, or potentially 2 weeks after the first dose of vaccination, and ask the question, did they then start having symptoms, or they then start having COVID? Thus far, if you do, no such data is available. And the only thing is there have been claims made in the press, etc. But the experience of the doctors at Gangaram Hospital and other hospitals. I mean, I've had tens of thousands of responses to my Twitter.
Yeah.
But the experience of the doctors in these hospitals suggests that if you are fully vaccinated thus far, that you have a protective response. So the idea is get vaccinated. From our standpoint, what I can do is to ensure that the vaccine raw materials are still being moved to India per schedule, and the vaccines are being manufactured, and the rollout continues as best it can, given the shortages of vaccine.
What, if anything, do we have in terms of the genome sequencing of the mutants that we see so far? And of course, we could see many more mutant strains, because the larger the number of infections, the larger the likelihood of mutations. What do we know about what's coming out of India so far?
So, the so-called double mutant strain, that's a misnomer. That's the wrong word to use, because in fact, it has 13 mutations on average.
Wow.
So the 2 mutations of concern have been consistently of concern. One of them is called the EEC mutation. It's the E484K, if I remember correctly. And the other one is a mutation in 454. So again, I might be, the numbers there are so many numbers here, but there are 2 mutations of concern. We know them from these mutations have also cropped up in other places. And the question that is on everyone's mind is, to what extent do these mutations decrease the effectiveness of vaccination and of natural immunity? Let me take one step back first, which is to say that the reason vaccination works, even if you've had COVID before, is that the amount of immunity that you get than if you've had COVID naturally. And so it is very important, even if you've had COVID before, to get vaccinated, because the amount of immune response that you get to the vaccine is much greater than the amount of immune response that you're getting to natural COVID infection. So that is yet another reason to get vaccinated. Now, all of that said, these 2 variants of these 2 mutations are of great concern. The so-called E to K mutation and the L to R mutation, the two mutations, are of great concern. And I think that, again, it would be very helpful to have data on patients who are getting vaccinated, have completed the vaccine, are 2 weeks post the second dose of, let's say, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and are still succumbing to COVID, and what the severity of that is. It's a simple survey, Barkha. It's not a very complicated survey. And I'm told that many hospitals, including the ICMR, which I have great respect for, is are doing this survey. Now, in the middle of, as I said, the fog of COVID, it's very difficult to do the survey, but it is not impossible. And I think it's very essential because it will guide what to do in terms of making the next generation of vaccines, if we need to make one, and figuring out what to do on top of that. One last thing that I'll say is that remember that vaccines aside, even if you're vaccinated, it is important to continue masking and isolation and social distancing, because those are measures that are non-vaccine measures that will eventually curb the infection. I'm fully vaccinated, but I still wear a mask, and I still have not stepped into a restaurant, and I'm still practicing social distancing and testing as well.
Although New York, where you are, is set to open restaurants, would you go into one now as a fully vaccinated New Yorker?
I have been extraordinarily careful because although New York is vaccinated, my children, because they don't qualify yet, are not vaccinated. So I'm extraordinarily careful, and I have not been dining indoors for the most part, aside from a few exceptions where I know that there is ample social distance between individuals. And certainly my children who are not vaccinated are not dining indoors in New York.
Now, Canada, we've had a statement in the last 2 days where the Canadian experts have actually privileged the mRNA vaccines over the other vaccines. So far, we've been telling everybody, take the vaccine that you get. I don't know if you've been following that, but they've basically said that the mRNA is the vaccine, that's Pfizer and Moderna, that offers greater protection. What is that going to do to people's perceptions of the vaccine, especially in the absence of vaccine equity in the world?
I think that it is not going to be simple or trivial for any country, including India, to suddenly convert to the mRNA-based vaccines. Those vaccines, the manufacture of those vaccines takes a long time, and there are some, as you very well know, IP issues that you and I cannot solve immediately. Those have to be solved on a global level. So it is not as if these mRNA-based vaccines can be just suddenly, the production of them can suddenly start. I think it is a wiser and a more expeditious way to move forward, as I said before, is to continue the vaccination, increase the production of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which we do know is effective. We need to know what the breakthrough infections are, given the 2 mutant strain, the double mutant, or the, as I said, the 13 mutation strain in India. We need to know what the breakthrough COVID rates are after full vaccination. But I don't think that, Canadians aside, I don't think that we can suddenly start manufacturing the mRNA-based vaccines from scratch. That would be very difficult to do in India.
Tell me this, in the absence of enough vaccines, because you said that people are working overtime to get more vaccines to India, but we're expecting shortages through July. And I have any number of questions on my live stream from people who were due for their second shot, but may not get it on time. And they're really worried, will the vaccine still be effective for them if they get it later than they're scheduled to get it?
So again, we don't know the full answer to that question because, as you know, how can you answer a question that's not been tried and tested? There is evidence from the mRNA-based vaccines, and there's evidence from the other vaccines that, in fact, one shot is also partially protective. And again, we need to move away from random anecdotal evidence to a more systematic evidence, and that's why I said that this survey should have started a month ago, but to what extent it has already started, I don't know. All I can say is that we can be confident that once this survey is done, once the real world evidence emerges, that we can become more for these vaccines and the strains that are in India. But from the mRNA vaccines and from the limited data that we have from the Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer vaccine, one jab is partially protective and produces partial immunity. We know this especially clearly from the mRNA vaccine. Again, it's a question of time. You don't get it immediately. The day you get vaccinated, you're not immune. The immunity builds up over time. It takes at least 2 to 3 weeks to build up immunity. And again, we need to find out how many people are getting the double mutant, as I said, is a misnomer, but I'll just call it now the double mutant strain, 2 weeks after or 3 weeks after the first dose of vaccine, and 2 weeks to 4 weeks after the second dose of vaccine. And that would be very important data.
So I have 5 minutes left with you, and I want to ask you in the end, Kiran Shaw and others have been advocating for a while, actually mixing and matching vaccines to deal with the phenomenon of these mutants. Do we have any preliminary research, any preliminary data that should be nudging us in this direction?
We do not have any real data that should be nudging us in that direction. Let me just take one step back before we get to that issue. We have some lab-based data that suggests and is very encouraging that both Covaxin and Covishield can produce neutralizing antibodies against the variant that is circulating in India, the B117 and B1617 variants that are circulating in India. But this is again lab data. This is not human data, but it's encouraging. And of course, you saw the testimony of the doctor from Gangaram Hospital. We do not have any data on mixing and matching vaccines, and in fact, given the fact that both vaccines are in short supply at this stage, I would say that, and the absence of data, I would advocate not mixing and matching, but sticking to the schedule that was advocated or that has been tested in clinical trials with both AstraZeneca and the Bharat Biotech vaccines. There can be, of course, parallel trials launched because of the infection rate. There can be parallel trials launched for mixing and matching vaccines, but at this stage, without we just don't know, and that may increase vaccine hesitancy rather than decrease it.
So let me ask you in the end, it's going to take us a couple of months, if we're lucky, to stabilize our vaccine supply, to get to the numbers that we need to for it to move as it should. In the absence of that, in the absence of a fully stabilized oxygen supply, would you advocate a national lockdown? We've had that sort of advice coming from Dr. Anthony Fauci for India. We had a bad experience with it last year. The government has been hesitant. But there's now a sense that we may be out of options till we can get more vaccines into India.
So I would advise, and I have advised, and please, on my Twitter feed, I made a list of things that could be done, and I would advise a graded approach. The graded approach, we talked about two aspects of the triangle. We haven't talked about the third aspect. We talked about oxygen and steroids. We talked about vaccination and vaccine supply chain. The third aspect is how to stabilize the problem as we see it now. My recommendation personally would be to set up, and I know this is being done already, is to continue to set up field hospitals. These field hospitals should be armed with the basics. So these are non-ventilator hospitals. These are not ICUs, but these are places where are in the open air, lots of ventilation. These field hospitals are being set up, I know. There could be the involvement, I would advise the involvement of the Army because they are very capable of operations work. To set up field hospitals, the thing that's required in these field hospitals are an oxygen saturation monitor, a mechanism to test for COVID, so that we can understand, who's infected and who's not infected, obviously oxygen itself and steroids. So to set up and fluids. So to set up a field hospital with adequate ventilation in multiple locations, potentially with the operations help from the Indian Army, I think would be the intermediate step. If if those steps fail, I'm afraid that the next step will be to really do a lockdown. And as you know, I mean, India is in sort of partial lockdown anyway. Parts of India are in partial lockdown anyway. But I would advise a graded approach as opposed to what happened last time, which created a social disaster out of a medical disaster. And so, go ahead.
Yeah, just a last question before we let you go, because I'm looking at the clock. I'm mindful of your time. There is a lot of, some would say, bad science being practiced in India out of panic. One example of this is the dispute among Indian doctors over remdesivir, which the WHO has officially taken off as a suggested therapeutic method. Similarly, plasma therapy causes great debate. But when you have anxious patients, and maybe doctors need to sort of, appear as if they're doing something, we're actually seeing smaller hospitals, doctors stand in crowded lines, almost creating a mass gathering in themselves to buy remdesivir injections in black. I just wanted your final word on the remdesivir debate.
So remdesivir works on some COVID patients. That's what the clinical trials have shown. But it does not reduce COVID deaths. It reduces the number of days of hospitalization from COVID. So I think that the recommendations are very clear. Priya Sampath Kumar and others who are infectious disease doctors, and I have been involved with them. We have set out and translated into multiple languages what would be the recommended course of action for a patient who tested positive for COVID. Please read them. I would encourage patients and doctors to read them. That is based on the current evidence that we have so far. And the evidence that we don't have so far has been put down at the bottom of the page. It is now available in 13 languages. It is available on my Twitter feed. It is available on Priya Sampath Kumar's Twitter feed. She's a doctor at the Mayo Clinic. And there are several others. I'm not acknowledging this was a project by several others. Okay. So that's my take on remdesivir. One last thing that I will say is that there are antibodies which have been shown to work against COVID and reduce the rate of hospitalization and the severity of infection. They are made by several companies, but the one that seems to be the most effective is the one from Regeneron. And we have been in dialogue because Regeneron is interested in donating several million doses of these antibodies in India. So we have been in dialogue with Indian doctors to get these antibodies so that they can be injected for high-risk patients, particularly patients who are likely to get severe COVID. And that has also been proven by clinical trials in the United States.
So that's some good news. Before we let you go, Siddharth, just a word of overarching advice for your home country. Just a last
well,
thought that you'd advise India.
Yeah, I think prevention is better than cure, and so the most important thing is to not gather in large unventilated public spaces, and keep social distancing, wear masks. That is the primary way that we will get out of this crisis. Continue vaccination as best we can. We on this end, as I said, are now opening up as far as we can the channels by which vaccine supplies can be increased. So continue vaccination. And number three, provide real data for us to understand the breakthrough COVID infections post real vaccination. And number four, as we are in the middle of this crisis, try to mitigate the crisis using graded steps as opposed to sudden social measures, which we know have been disastrous during the first wave of COVID.
Thanks, Siddharth. Thank you for your time. Learned a lot from this conversation. Hope your family in Delhi is safe.
I hope they stay safe too as well. They're isolating. They are performing. You know, they're masked and they're vaccinated. So it is my own vote of confidence in the vaccination that I got my entire family, who was eligible, anyone who was eligible, vaccinated as early as possible. And I would encourage people to do so, even as we produce data about the real world effects of the vaccination. Thank you, Barkha. And again, my condolences to you, and my heart breaks for all the people who have suffered through this catastrophe.
Thank you, Siddharth. We'll get you back soon as we can to learn more. And thank you for your time. Thank you. Bye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.